I move a lot, it's because I have a new knee, which gets stiff. If I fall, don't pick me up. So a couple of things. That rehearsal, generously said by Bob, makes me sound competent, at least. But I would dispute that, partly because I will never forget my experience shaping and running that Head Start. I thought that what you did in a preschool program was you played with delightful children. They were in a public housing project that did not make them any the less delightful. And required by the National Head Start, I had to go to what's called a training about 3 months in. I was never so completely embarrassed in my entire life. It turned out there were things you were supposed to do with them other than play. Call it designed to play, if you will, but I hadn't a clue. If I were immodest before them, I've never been anything but able to be modest since, I hope. Good teaching is often an exercise in failure and not submitting to it. So to talk about Emerson in this sanctuary, it has a special resonance, which I'll come to in a moment. But first, I do want to thank the Vermont Humanities Council, Cindy for all she's done to keep me in track, and my two marvelous sound people who have fastened me up well, I think. And I hope they'll unfasten me at the end. To talk about Emerson in a congregational church is resonant because Emerson was the pastor of the first congregational church in Boston for almost 12 years. His father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were all ministers. By the time he took over the congregation, it was Unitarian, no longer called congregational. He resigned after those 12 years, saying that it was the most empty experience he had ever had. And though God in some form, metaphoric or actual, recurs in everything he writes, he never presented himself as a particularly godly man. He's interesting for many reasons. In an era before television, radio, certainly cell phones, lectures were the form of mass entertainment. He traveled everywhere in the country. He was probably the most popular lecturer before the Civil War, all across the then United States, except the South. And he made enough money from those lecture fees to live decently, handsomely even, in Concord. So when you hear Self-Reliance, he did not ever give it in the form I'm going to talk about it. About 10 years before, he gave a lecture called The Individual. And if you look at it, you'll find repeats and echoes of what comes later. But what comes later is thought through in a rather remarkable way. The other piece of background you need to know is something called the Panic of 1837. Never, in my experience, adequately taught in American history courses. It was the first Great Depression in American history. Banks collapsed everywhere. The cotton mills stopped running. Half of his inherited money from his deceased wife, disappeared. He became overnight 50% less well off. He celebrated the Panic of 1837. He only wished for it to keep going. Because he said, the more the merchants of State Street and the merchants of Wall Street fall on their faces, the better off our country will be. A sentiment worth still echoing, maybe. So, as you think about Self-Reliance, if you keep in mind that it's written essentially only 2 years after that panic, and when its effects were still thoroughly felt throughout the society. Self-Reliance is surely Emerson's best known and most read essay. Its title might seem to tell us all we need to know. Quote, depend on myself, be independent, even walk alone in the world. That would seem to sum it up. The skeptics among us might rightly shake their heads. Need he or we be reminded that every human being is tied to others? mothers and fathers, children if we have them, to jobs and thus usually co-workers and bosses, partners and spouses. What indeed of the bonds and the complexities of intimacies? If we're self-reliant, what happens to them? Many of us know that the human race could not have survived without social bonds, communities with others, like us or not, a nurtured and cultivated attention to other human beings. Isolated individuals do not survive. Commonly, in the post-Civil War 19th century, Emerson's essay got adopted by true believers, men generally. They positioned it within a developing and soon dominant belief system. I think I've got, no, an ideology. It got read literally as a justification not only for what was taken to be a free market, minimal government interference in the economy, or anything limiting the power of the newly rich, what came to be known after the Civil War as the robber barons. This reading took the essay as a self-evident injunction to stand alone, not to tolerate any claims by others, and to regard those who didn't as weak failures deserving their fate, whatever that might be. In reality, only the rich and others who were powerful could persuade themselves, and sadly yet many Americans, that they were actually standing alone, self-reliant as they saw it. Often, they inherited money and privilege. More critically, they were dependent on long chains of connection. Workers in their homes and factories, those building and running the railroads, miners, those who bought their products and services, and many more. And indeed, immigrants from all over the world were the critical component in the industrial expansion, not financiers. Without cheap labor that they could exploit, they couldn't have done any of what they did. And by the way, there were no legal or illegal immigrants in those days because there were no rules whatsoever. Despite people who keep saying, my ancestors came here and followed the rules. That's crap. Until 1924, they didn't exist, except for the Chinese, who were barred. As the economy became more complex, as it did in the second half of the 19th century, at the end of which the United States was the most developed industrial power in the world, the more interconnected everything was. Should we, or even must we, read Self-Reliance as legitimating such wealth and power? An intriguing and beautifully written call for a laissez-faire, let things be or leave them alone, economy and society. As such, people's relationships would be casual, holding only until they were no longer in the interest of even one of the parties, an atomistic society, a cruel society. Emerson's writing in Self-Reliance often seems to move in just such a place. Especially in the first half of the essay, his memorably strong and vivid phrases almost seduce readers to aspire to an utterly self-sufficient and apparently isolated state. Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string, he says. Or, infancy conforms to nobody, all conform to it. Or this long passage, which I love, about, quote, the nonchalance of boys who are sure of dinner. Sorry. Sometimes I think I'm the only one whose pages always stick. The nonchalance of boys who are sure of a dinner and would disdain as much as a lord to do, or say ought to conciliate one, is the healthy attitude of human nature. A boy is in the parlor what the pit is in the playhouse, independent, irresponsible, looking out and from his corner on such people and facts as pass by. He tries and sentences them on their merits, in the swift summary way of boys, as good, bad, interesting, silly, eloquent, troublesome. He cumbers himself never about consequences. He gives an independent, genuine verdict. You must court him. He does not court you. Now, who can thus, he says, avoid all pledges and having observed, observe again from the same unaffected, unbiased, unbribable, unaffrighted innocence, must always be formidable. He would utter opinions on all passing affairs which, in a memorable metaphor, would sink like darts into the ear of men and put them in fear. Now, you think about this charming and eloquent, attractive even if you are in a certain position, with a certain truth to it? And are we, in fact, to take it as a kind of model for self-reliance? Clearly, Emerson, partly at least, thinks so. In one concept of self-reliance, this long passage ends in an assertion of power over others, those darts in the ear, and an apparent claim of independence, but in actual dependence on others. Emerson's darts requires others' ears and fear. And he would be the first to remind us that because almost any form of power requires the subordination of others, it cannot be a component of true self-reliance. You are relying on others even as victims. Almost immediately, Emerson seems to contradict himself, which often happens, writing, quote, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." Now we're to men, not boys. He moves, that is, in these pages from infants and then adolescents as models of nonconformity to, quote, being a man. Here he establishes nonconformity as the ideal his readers and auditors are being encouraged to take on or else admit being less than fully human. But what exactly is nonconformity? I want to take us through the essay for a bit to see how it develops, to become more familiar with Emerson's key terms, better to grasp what he might mean, and to notice any substantial changes in his argument and rhetoric. Let's begin with nonconformity. Can we, with Emerson's help, make it less abstract and vague? Here is probably the most famous passage in the essay. These are the voices which we hear in solitude, but they grow faint and inaudible as we enter into the world. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree, for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder, to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. The virtue in most respects is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. Conformity that is, loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. So here we're clearly in both a social and economic world in the metaphor. It's they, it's corporate shareholders, it's a joint stock company, and they are responsible for persuading us to give up our self-reliance on the grounds that if you don't, we won't pay you, feed you, etc. Strong motive. It might seem that here is criticized only a vague conformity, but a joint stock company, a corporate metaphor, has members who conspire to make others, if they are dependably to get their bread, to surrender their liberty and culture. So Emerson proposes, for a modest guarantee of what seems just a bare standard of living, people yield their freedom and, interestingly, their culture, that is, their ways of making sense of the world they live in. So you might say, worse than taking bread from people is to take over their minds and strip them, which is what he's saying here. So they no longer are creators, but they are controlled by a dominant language of names and customs generated by those stockholders. Conformity in this passage is not only a social process, but a conspiracy by the controllers of corporations and thus what shapes society. Despite how often Emerson may seem to be condemning society in any form, a closer reading shows him criticizing specific practices and their consequences. Instead, the individuals, are the center of his concern and is addressed in this essay. They make society what it is and what it fails to be. That is, you can talk about individuality and society, depending on how you do it. Self-reliance is presented more indirectly than concretely defined. Emerson builds by sharp language, sometimes in rebuke, others in praise, and yet others in injunctions as here. Hard blockheads only drive nails all the time, forever remembering, which is fixing. Heroes do not fix, but flow, bend forward ever, and invent a resource for every moment. Interesting distinction. He abhors anything fixed, orthodox, or conventional. any influence for, quote, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Integrity means wholeness for Emerson, and what he calls self-trust, which he recognizes is difficult to attain. He lays out self-trust clearly and often. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. His words recall his many invocations of solitude in this essay, but they also imply a connection of the solitary individual to others, to an idea of a society of true individuals. One could argue that Emerson is a man of faith, though never of creed. His sentences at best are often exhilarating, in the beginning of Self-Reliance especially. Quote, there is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better or worse as his portion, that though the wide universe, here I go again, is full of good kernel of nourishing corn, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given to him to till. The power which resides in him is new in nature. That is to say, every single one of us is given a particular ground to till, called ourself, and that each one of us is entirely new in the creation. Lest any here think this is simply fanciful or idealistic, a term of abuse Emerson especially disliked, as do I, it's always dismissive, considers one special finding of modern genetics. Each of us is genetically unique, even it appears as our identical twins. And though the evidence is necessarily partial, because historically limited, every person born in and before historical time we know about is also unique. We resemble other humans, we are connected, but we are not the same at all. So it follows, quote, we are now men and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendental destiny, and not minors and invalids in a protected corner, and not cowards fleeing before a revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort and advancing on chaos and the dark. Notice here his collective address, in itself complicating any reading, is one of forming some form of capitalist or aggrandizing self. His words here and in the previous quotation also indicate a deep commitment to democracy as a form which can enable the radical individuality he proposes, and throughout, a notion of truly independent individuals who can, in turn, create a substantive democratic order in which every person is truly equal but different. Think what that would be like. To be one of these men requires nonconformity. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. It also requires an unusual form of solitude. Quote, it is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. His notion here is to be in society, but not of it. And I stop at the perfect sweetness, a special use of language one might go right by. Does it suggest a distance from controversy and argument, and a calm assurance of one's own way of being and seeing and thinking? If one lacks perfect sweetness, then one might be worrying about others, engaging them in one's head, failing of self-reliance. But perfect sweetness is perfect peace with oneself. How many of us have achieved in ourselves perfect sweetness? Forget about others, since we may be harder to forgive even than the worst of our acquaintances. I have some. Irish Catholic families are big, alcoholic, and extremely trying. Emerson moves through the essay by naming what limits nonconformity and reminding his readers of the power that resides in them if they embrace independence. Conformity, quote, scatters your force, so do your work and you shall reinforce yourself. Or most men have bound their eyes with one or another handkerchief. Unbind, he says, and see everything you can. Quote, act singly, and what you've already done singly will justify you now. Memory, he calls, a corpse. It binds us to a past which can give us no life, he says, but tempts us to regrets. It keeps us from the present, which is where life is. And it tempts us to consistency and thus to an anxiety which makes us conform to an idea of who we have been and thus who we must be. In one of his most famous quotations, which Bob used, often extracted from the essay, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. With consistency, a great soul has nothing to do. Speak what you think now in hard words. And tomorrow, speak what tomorrow thinks, though it contradicts everything you said yesterday. Think how much fun that could be and also how difficult that could be. To be consistent, then, is to worry about how we appear to others, and it anchors us in what has been, not in what is before us. Man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present. Keep in mind, then, that, quote, never was anything gained by admitting the omnipotence of limitations, but all immortal action is an overstepping of these busy rules. At this point, we might reasonably ask, attend all these definitions and often jabbing commentaries, what might we become? I'm going to read from the text on page 154. I will stand here for humanity, and though I would make it kind, I would make it true. Let us affront and reprimand the smooth mediocrity and squalid contentment of the times, and hurl in the face of custom and trade and office the fact which is the upshot of all history, that there's a great responsible thinker and actor working wherever a man works. That a true man belongs to no other time or place, but is the center of things. Where he is, there is nature. He measures you and all men and all events. Ordinarily, everybody in society reminds us of someone else or of some other person. Character, reality, reminds you of nothing else. It takes the place of the whole creation. Now, as you listen, you have to be thinking several things that I can't predict, but also how difficult this is. What he proposes has no ease, in fact. Also, lest the repetition of man deflects you, you should know that this was the utterly prevailing convention he rarely broke, ironically, of how you referred to humankind. He had the most remarkable group of women friends, some of the real leaders in the country, including in developing a liberation movement, including his wife, who was one of the leading abolitionists before he became one. And he complained often that she left him alone at the house to go to abolitionist meetings, and spoke firmly, he says. If you know a lot about his wife, you can believe that she was marvelous. Depending on how we hear and think, some or all of this thus far might inspire or disgruntle, seem foolish or simply impractical. Yet there remains some especially challenging, even troubling passage. As I read, please follow in your handout. I hope we might then break for a bit and discuss what you make of this long passage. So this is the handout, and it's long. I'm going to read it to you, but it's arguably one of the most difficult things in the whole essay. And I want you to have it in front of you so you didn't have to trust your ears alone. On my saying, what I have to do with the sacredness of traditions if I live wholly from within, my friend suggested, but these impulses may be from below, not from above. I replied, they do not seem to me to be such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution. The only wrong, what is against it. A man is to carry himself in the presence of all opposition as if everything were titular and ephemeral, but he. I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions, in which he included all churches. Every decent and well-spoken individual affects and sways me more than is right. I ought to go upright and vital and speak the rude truth in all ways. If malice and vanity wear the coat of philanthropy, shall that pass? If an angry bigot assumes this bountiful case of abolition and comes to me with his last news from Barbados, why should I not say to him, go love thy infant, love thy woodchopper, be good-natured and modest, have that grace, and never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off. Thy love afar is spite at home. Rough and graceless would be such greeting, but truth is handsomer than the affectation of love. Your goodness must have some edge to it, else it is none. The doctrine of hatred must be preached as the counteraction of the doctrine of love when that pules and whines. I shun father and mother and wife and brother when my genius calls me. I would write on the lintels of the doorpost, whim. I hope it is somewhat better than whim at last, but we cannot spend the day in explanations. Expect me not to show cause why I seek or why I exclude company. Then again, do not tell me, as a good man did today, of my obligation to put all poor men in good situations. Are they my poor? I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me, and to whom I do not belong. There is a class of persons to whom by all spiritual affinity I am bought and sold. For them I will go to prison if need be, but your miscellaneous popular charities, the education at college of fools, the building of meeting houses to the vain end to which many now stand, alms to the sots, and the thousandfold relief societies, though I confess with shame I sometimes succumb and give the dollar, it is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold. Men do what is called a good action as some piece of courage or charity, much as they would pay a fine in expiation. Their works are done as an apology or extenuation of their living in the world. As invalids and the insane pay a high board. Their virtues are penances. So, reactions. I won't say another word until I get at least one. And I have to move a little. I recognize raised hands anywhere. That should not go down, right? You shouldn't let me leave thinking that you accept these words. Otherwise, I will think that. I think Manchester is filled with, well, I don't know what to call you yet.
A lot of contradiction.
A lot of contradiction. Can you give an example?
That's about everything that he says.
In this. Good. So more. Yes, Bob.
You know, he's a creature of context, of what you're saying to all about. And I'm trying to figure out if the purveyors of conformity around him were probably the church.
Yeah.
It was probably all the classical education that was being proffered by whoever you want to, whatever institution.
Higher education especially was very dull.
Yeah. The abolition movement was raging around Boston, not necessarily in Concord. Well, Concord.
No, it was in Concord too.
And so, I mean, what I'm trying to figure out is if you took the context that he had, that he was operating in, can you identify, like there was the me generation of today. Is there anything that if you leapt 150 years or whatever ahead, that you could say, oh, well, that's pretty much like what's going on?
I don't think I want to do that exactly, but to remind you that industrialism is taking hold. The creation of mass poverty is well along its way. The Irish immigrants have begun to pour into Boston and be housed in cellars where they got fevers and died in great numbers, those who'd survived Ireland. There were Irish laborers and maids who worked in Concord, lived in shacks in the woods. And already there was a considerable new rich, especially in Boston, and who, if they made any gestures towards social good, did it in the form of philanthropies. of various kinds, including alms for the poor. Not rightly, I think, in Emerson's eyes, any serious attempt to enable poor people not to be poor, but to keep them poor. And that philanthropy for him, as I think remains the case, is a way in which those who are the philanthropists are engaging in a kind of power and ego trip. They may by accident do some good, but not deliberately. And often they make things they pretend to solve much worse. School reform is one example I know lots about. Hedge fund managers took it over, and they destroyed public school after public school, because competition and corporate management is the answer to all problems. Well, it doesn't answer anything in education except to destroy. So he is, in his world, facing those things, some of which we do face in different forms than our own. He also, when he says, if any angry bigot assumes this bountiful case of abolition and comes to me with his last news from Barbados, why should I not say to him, go love thy infant, love thy woodchopper, be good-natured and modest, have that grace, and never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off, thy love afar is spite at home. He's clearly talking about somebody he knows. I don't think he's making this person up. And I'm sure Manchester is filled only with the best intentioned people. Where I live is not. And one of the forms it takes is fanaticism in the name of a cause. And it often means that love at home is not at all present. And that one is justifying oneself by one's righteousness about something far away. It doesn't always have to be that way by any means, and I don't think he's saying that, but he is saying, if you use your support for abolition safely for black people far away to cover for yourself your bad treatment of your woodchopper, classic working class figure of the time, thy love afar is spite at home. So he's actually giving us, if you will, categories. I think you have to pull this apart to make it, I think, bearable at times. Because when you first read it, you think, oh, wait a minute. He's condemning all acts of decency? Sounds that way. And it even reads that way, and it's some of the strongest language in the whole essay. Most people skip it. When I teach this essay to undergraduates, I say to them before they go to read this essay, and don't skip that, because I'm going to ask you to explain it to me and how you respond. So one of the things that's curious about this essay is the way it will move from what seems to be actually only rhetorical to quite concretely directed to particular problems. But you do need to have it in your hands, especially if you need to dismiss the essay. But it reads powerfully and shockingly, I think. If I'm wrong, tell me.
At the very end, he sweeps back in the other direction pretty hard, I would suggest.
Yes, he does.
And you know, the first couple of sentences are just shockingly arrogant. There's you know, and he at once says, well, whatever I feel is right, and if anyone disagrees with me, they're wrong. Unless I change my mind,
Yeah, I'm glad you picked this up. I was waiting, because those first sentences are the hardest, right? So if my friend suggested, but these impulses may be from below, not from above, I replied, they do not seem to me to be such, but if I'm the devil's child, so what? I will live from the devil. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Imagine a courtroom if you'd committed a crime and said, right, this is just according to my nature. All right. So the first claims in that opening is really the toughest. Because if we are all our own law, what happens? Is that a place that we could imagine?
all too easily.
I have no idea what you have in mind, but we're not there yet either. So, depending on how we hear and think, some or all of this, thus far, might inspire or disgruntle, seem foolish or impractical. Yet there remain some especially challenging and even troubling passages which I've had you look at. The essay on self-reliance gets stronger and by some measure clearer as it goes. What he calls, quote, the highest truth on the subject, he also suggests cannot be named because it is but remembering of an intuition, and intuition by definition, Emerson, flies from one's head. Quote, the thought by what I can now nearest approach to say it is this: when good is near you, when you have life in yourself, it is not by any known or accustomed way. The way, the thought, the good, shall be wholly strange and new. It shall exclude example and experience. Now, for anybody who's engaged in teaching sometimes, in writing, in sculpting, in any art, those sentences should make a lot of sense. Because it's then that you actually move to someplace you never had in your head, and something new happens. I have a friend who has now passed away, but was a superb novelist. And he and I used to work in the library, me on my pathetic dissertation, he on one of his greatest novels. And the library had all the lights off, and so whenever we needed breaks from our writing, unknown to each other, we would cruise the dark stacks, and we backed into each other one night, and both of us screamed bloody murder. And when we settled down, I asked him what he was doing, he asked me what I was doing, and then he said apologetically, so he said, I hope you understand, he said, I created a character that was supposed to be dead after 10 pages. I'm now 200 pages into this novel, and I cannot get rid of him, and he's awful. And I said, Bob, you can still kill him off. He said, no, he's taken over the novel. And when you read the novel, that's the case. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary character. And you understand why my bumping into him, it was lucky he had no weapons, because he thought I was that character for a moment. This may describe, but it does not define. Expressive as Emerson is here and elsewhere in the essay, he struggles to find words for what he senses when he is confident in his own powers, as against what he knows of his own lack of self-reliance. His rebukes are more self-directed than simply critique of us or others. On the same page where he attempts to articulate the highest truth, he tries again, and for me comes closer, though the words slip away from the realities he seeks to speak. Trying to hold an experience which must, as he grapples, slip almost instantaneously away, creates, in fact, a kind of poetry. It may reach some of us with great clarity in the moment, and then also leave us, as it does Emerson. Words are only referential, remember, not beings or states of mind or feelings. They often become static and inert. Listen closely for what you hear might lead you to realize or to recognize. Life, he says, only avails, not the having lived. Power ceases in the instant of repose. It resides in the moment of transition from a past to a new state, in the shooting of the gulf and darting to an aim. This one fact the world hates, that the soul becomes, for that forever degrades the past, turns all riches to poverty, all reputations to a shame, confounds the saint with the rogue. Why then do we prate of self-reliance? To talk of reliance is a poor external way of speaking. Speak rather of that which relies, because it works and is. So, life only avails. And there's no such thing as self-reliance, because there's no such thing as a static self either. You can't rely on something slipping away from your consciousness all the time. So he can describe something about what it feels like to him when he feels original or a new idea comes to him. These words don't simply redefine self-reliance, they move to a much deeper state. Not only is life changing every minute for all of us, the self is not stable or static, there cannot thus be reliance, an immobile state, only the active relies, avails, and becomes. We may rest, we may seek stability, worry what our neighbors think, please our teachers, and attend to what other people expect of us. But these are mere habits and ways we fail ourselves, fail to reach a full life to the extent we rely on them. That requires living in the present, even in the moment, and trusting our impulse. Frightening. Many seek solace and justification in property, he reminds us. Near the end of the essay, Emerson makes clear that self-reliance has nothing to do with the pursuit of monetary fortune. And so, he says, the reliance on property, including the reliance on governments which protect it, is the want of self-reliance. They measure their esteem of each other by what he has and not by what each is. Now, keep in mind that, especially insurance companies in the second half of the 19th century, but large corporations took this essay and cut pieces of it out, put it on their calendars, put it on their corporate reports. Do you think they ever cut this out? I can assure you, not once. It's not even hinted at. So, to end, all men have my blood, and I all men's. Emerson imagines what a truly democratic society might look like. It would be one in which every woman and man possessed fully their uniqueness. None would be, in each their difference, in thrall, captive to the power of anyone else. All would be equal, but none alike. It need not be noisy, certainly not trivial, but rich in the wonder of each person's being. And because of self-reliance, better individuality, what would be achieved would be well beyond our present severely limited imaginations, our stark inequalities in wealth and power, in education, in health, and one could go on. Can we put Emerson away as a mere visionary? Only to our great loss. For he would have us arise from our unhappy and diminished present states to self-distrust, and thus living our lives, reaching beyond all we know and now see. I thank you. And not only am I happy to take questions, I love being disagreed with, because that's how I start to learn things. Yes. So, my questioner reminds us of Andrew Carnegie's writing a huge bestseller later in the century called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he acknowledges his own, actually, embarrassment at being so incredibly rich, and his resolution to give it away. So what would Emerson say about him, and then what would Emerson say about his recipients? So I don't need to remind you, because probably all of you are aware of the fact that one of the things Carnegie did was build beautiful libraries in small places all over the country, including all over Massachusetts. They often look like temples of learning, to quote him. He also endowed collection monies for them. Now, probably we all know about libraries. Can we fault libraries for accepting any dollar, no matter where it comes from? I'm not ready yet to do that. But Carnegie's story is a very, very interesting one. He is one of the very few examples in all of American history of somebody who actually rose from rags to riches. Most of the others, it's a pretense, and they never rose that far, including our current president, who never earned a penny either, by the way. So one of the issues with Carnegie was that he didn't believe in inheritance. So none of his children inherited a penny from him. The Carnegie Foundation for Peace got all of that. But the thing that baffles him, and it's fun to read about after The Gospel of Wealth, he gave away more than $1 million a day for the last 30 years of his life. Count that up. And he was making more each day than he could give away. So he ended up with more money than he'd given away. Now it's clear what Emerson would have said. This is absolutely obscene. And this is a man who's giving away, despite the fact that he screwed all of his workers, actually hired militia which shot them down when they unionized or tried to unionize, paid people not a living wage in the steel factories, The night before the strike happened at his steel mills, he had hired an army to wait along the river outside Pittsburgh, and as they floated down on rafts, to shoot them dead. 80% of them were killed. He was on a cruise boat to Scotland in his mansion there, so nobody could lay it to his feet, but to his partner, Henry Frick, who was no dilly either. Carnegie was a brilliant publicist, a brilliant rumor of his own reputation. There's good mixed with bad, no question. But why should people who make lots of money control our society by what they give and what they don't give? Someday, the founder of Microsoft, I hope in heaven if nowhere else, will go on trial for the evil his philanthropy has done. And it's been very great. He listens to no one, he decides who deserves what, and he gives it to them regardless of what they tell him about their need. And he gets ideas in his head nobody can shake. I have grandchildren in the New York City public schools, which he's ruined. When you're in 8th grade, you have to make a list of your 10 in 6th grade, desired middle schools, then you do it again for high school. This list goes into a computer someplace. In order for you to have those names on the list, you have to, with a parent at least, have visited every one of the schools you put on the list. Then they run them to the computer with no guarantee you're going to get any of them. And you should be surprised, the poor neighborhood kids, they don't get their choices at all. They're kept aside, basically, though the school system does not admit this, so you can balance schools. You don't hold rich people's kids aside for that reason. Philanthropy, it seems to me, is always questionable. And the fact that it's rarely anonymous makes it more so. So I now walk through a college, a small college, though with a huge endowment, in which our current president has invited everybody who wants to give $50, I swear. I'm tempted to see what I would get if I did it. There are plaques everywhere. You can't even pee in a urinal without a plaque. That I feel has a sort of justice to it to me, but the rest does not. And people who give money, who want their name memorialized that way, no. You give because you think it's a good thing to do and should not, as the Bible says, let the left hand know what the right does. True philanthropy is anonymous. And internally, you take no credit for it. Because you did not earn that money. Who earns $1 million, let alone our 580 billionaires? Who earns more than 500,000 even? If we set a cap on salaries, 500,000 would be, it seems to me, a reasonable cap. Then you could afford to live in Manhattan because the rents would all come down. But it's a difficult matter. I don't dislike Carnegie. I teach The Gospel of Wealth because I think it's a book that makes my students think. And sometimes I have to get in fierce rhetorical questioning of them about it. But it's a great question. Thank you. Others? Yes?
Do your own thing.
Yes?
Okay, that's the mantra of the 60s, and Emerson coined that term.
Basically.
Do your own thing, and I shall know you.
Yes.
Surprised you didn't mention it.
Well, I'm a child of the 60s, but not that child. But that doesn't make your point unfair at all. You have to, again and again, with Emerson, ask this kind of question. What would be the consequence if everyone followed what he preaches? Would it, in fact, begin to do what he thinks it would do, or not? Now, I liked the 60s. I thought doing your own thing was not a bad idea. But you should also know that I was notorious even in Catholic high school for being a rule breaker before I read Emerson. But the world was filled in the 60s with lots of foolishness. Now, to then claim that those of us who were in our teens and 20s ended foolishness, well, you should pick me up and throw me out the door. Foolishness goes with being human. Probably we're never going to be rid of it. People preaching well-meaning things that they believe will make our lives better I think actually Emerson would say that he would be the first to distrust them because they're formulas. And so to say do your own thing extracts from Emerson a piece, but not the whole. Did Emerson engage in public debates? The answer is no. It's not that he avoided them necessarily. For instance, the debate about abolition raged in Concord. The minister of the First Church there cut all the Thoreau women and Emerson's wife out of the congregation for their speaking up about it. They were appalled. There were many, many supporters of slavery in Concord, which most people don't realize. And he was criticized strongly by many of his close friends because he wouldn't come out publicly against it until the Fugitive Slave Act. Then he wrote a very powerful essay. He didn't believe in debate. He did believe in conversation. But if you think about some of the things I've read, you can understand why debate he would see as a kind of static positioning back and forth, and going nowhere, ultimately. My own experience of debate. Yes? So for some reason, reading this, my mind went to Ayn Rand. Probably the most devastating condemnation one could make of Emerson.
I remember the chill well.
I think that's an important question. She was a great extractor of what pleased her. And she surely read Emerson. And she surely read an Emerson who had nothing social in him. If you didn't want to see it, you could, listening, you could see how you could go by it. It's in there, and it's in there in subtle but important ways. And he's not talking about a society, the economic individual at all. But she could you and I could sit down if we had time and go through it, and we could underline the things. If we pulled them out, she'd say, oh, yes, to this. Is he responsible for Ayn Rand? No. But yes, you're right. The question is, in effect, the relationship between Thoreau and Emerson having to do when Thoreau refuses to pay his local taxes and is put in jail, and Emerson comes to call on him and he says, why are you in there? Thoreau's actual response is, why are you out there? Which I love. Emerson was often an embarrassment to those closest to him because of his aversion to public things. He really was deeply private, though he lectured, but he did not like engaging in controversy. I think he felt it was sterile, and Thoreau would never describe himself as Emerson's disciple, though maybe his pupil sometimes. But by the time that Thoreau was in the jail, they had become quite estranged, in fact, quite cruelly estranged, which they remained until about 5 years before Thoreau died, but they never resumed the intimacy they had early on. Emerson wrote a stunning obituary for Thoreau, who died young of consumption. But it's also a very, very ambivalent obituary. And there's some people who hold it against Emerson when you read it. He then thought and said that Thoreau was a good leader of a huckleberry hunt, but not, in effect, much good for anything else. Now, earlier than that, before Thoreau dies, he sees it quite differently. There's a brilliant new biography of Thoreau out, one of the greatest biographies I've ever read, by a woman who almost feels like she inhabits Thoreau. And I've studied and taught him for years, and I learned so much from reading this. And her sentences are so lively that you sometimes forget you're reading about Thoreau. And what she shows us is that how profound his dedication was to the way of life he developed. And there are things about him that I never knew before. Did you know that his father made a fortune in the manufacturing of pencils? He was the pencil supplier for the country, which was important because of how trade was taking off and people needed to mark things. And the pencils that existed when his father started making them were sort of grease sticks. And they slid all over the place and they left marks on things. Thoreau invented a new pencil and a new insert in the pencil. Now, those are things you don't ever hear. And Emerson was gentry, in effect. Thoreau was not. even though his father, started as a regular working class person with a trade, and eventually it became a small fortune. But the Thoreau women, I think, upset Emerson as much as Thoreau did. He never mentions them once. And they were fierce. They came to his house a number of times and confronted him about his not supporting abolition. So, others? One more, okay. Yes?
How do you suppose Emerson felt about humility?
He loved giving others.
I think he, believe it or not, I think he actually was a modest man. And he would affirm humility as long as it was not out of cowardice. That is, you could be humble to yourself, but you should not seek the approval from others of your humility. So I think one of the things that made him shy of certain forms of society was not a fear of being judged, but as he says at one point in one of his journals, my 3 close friends just departed, all 3 women, including Margaret Fuller, and I do not know how to talk to them. And that is my failing. And it wasn't just women. It was almost anyone. Thoreau lived in the house for part of the time early, and then was sort of their handyman off and on. And I think for a long time that was more comfortable to Emerson, because here was this person who inhabited many of the ideas he did, but also went in different directions. But I do think he was actually humble. He was a very strong writer. That doesn't mean he wasn't humble. Not in my eyes. Okay? Thank you very much for being patient.